So hello and welcome to day 2 of this joint event between ADBI and the Centre for Sustainable Finance at SOAS University of London. So this is a continuation of yesterday's event looking at the issue of sustainable finance for Asia's transition to net zero. We will be continuing the interesting discussions that we had yesterday. Today we will have 1 keynote speech and 4 paper presentations. My name is John Byrne. I'm the Vice Chair of Research at ADBI. And I will be chairing the sessions today. So our keynote speaker is Eugene Wong. He's the CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, which is an independent institute established to catalyze ideas on sustainable finance at the policy level in ASEAN. Eugene was previously Managing Director, Corporate Finance and Investment of the Securities Commission Malaysia. Today, Eugene will be speaking for 20 minutes on the topic transitions, common approaches for different starting points. So Eugene will speak for 20 minutes, as I said, and we will have a 10-minute Q&A round. Please type your questions into the Q&A box or the chat, or somehow signal that you wish to ask a question, and I will try to come to you. I would now hand the floor to Eugene, who has 20 minutes. So please go ahead, Eugene. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you very much to ADBI for inviting me to share my views at this event. I have a small presentation which I'd like to share with all of you. I believe, yes, it's loaded. So I wanted to focus my discussions today really on Southeast Asia, because this is where I'm most familiar with, and this is where I see a lot of change coming through. And it's quite interesting because someone asked me about 2 years back, what do you think is been the most significant change you've seen in Southeast Asia? What's really attracted your attention? And I said that my mother is finally talking about climate change, which is very interesting because she's 80 years old. So it is something that's reaching all of us in this part of the world. Let me first start by talking about energy transition and why it's important. Southeast Asia emits about 7% of the total emissions globally. But if you look at the mix of those emissions, 46% of it comes from energy use. And Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines actually have energy emissions as the largest portion of all the emissions overall. Now, Indonesia may not have emissions from the energy sector as its largest source, but if you look at it from an absolute amount, it's actually very big. So we've all been talking about trying to shift towards a greener energy future, and it's going to be a very expensive exercise. Based on the IEA's report on the SDS scenario, we're looking at having to spend close to $200 billion a year from 2026 to 2030. And overall, the figures vary based on different studies, but it comes to $2 to $3 trillion needed to enable us to make that green jump. Now, that's a lot of money. So it will need to be financed, right? It's a huge amount of money, but it's an amount of money that's needed. The problem right now is that the public sector is actually accounting for almost 90% of our region's infrastructure investments, but the public sector capital can only finance realistically around 50% of the total investment requirements. And as you know, similar to much of the rest of the world, as a result of the economic impact on government finances from COVID, we really need that private sector contribution right now. ASEAN is the 4th largest economy in the world by 2030. Right now, it's the 5th. And that GDP growth rate we're going to experience is approximately 4% over the next 10 years. So if you can imagine this, the energy needs will be increasing significantly over the next decade. It's not a question about just demand or supply, it's a question of balancing both demand and supply. We have challenges for transition in Southeast Asia. And one of the main challenges is the diversity of the economic and social constructs of our member states, as well as the resources they have available to them. So if you look at our 10 member states, the highest GDP per capita per annum is 60,000, and the lowest is 1,300. Now that's a really, really big gap. So how do we deal with this? Because if we want to move as a region, we are a collaborative effort. If we want to move as a region, that transition must be able to cater to the different starting points of our member states. Hence, the topic of my talk today, which is how do you deal with different starting points with a single approach? Let's take a step back and talk about the challenges for energy transition in this part of the world. What's really causing the problem? Well, I mentioned to you the different starting points and trajectories because people have different starting points, they have different resources, they have different hardwired infrastructure, which is the second point. The legacy infrastructure is there. We will have very different trajectories. As an example, 8 of our countries actually have a net zero target. 6 of them have a 2050 target, 1 a 2060 and 1 a 2065. The second thing is actually the resource bases countries have and their reliance on fossil fuels, not just as a source of energy, but also as a source of exports and revenue generation for governments. And of course, there's a lack of financing. Now, why is there a lack of financing? Everyone talks about how much money there is flowing around in the world to support green projects, but really it's quite hard to get financing if you talk to people. And what is the issue at hand? Well, firstly, there's no common approach or standard. There is no common language or understanding as to what qualifies as green or transition. There's also a need to localize the global ambition. Many FIs actually have a global approach. That global approach may not fit into the ASEAN context. It's not contextualized sufficiently. There's also a lack of clarity on how to assess eligibility and at what level. So we talk about transition, we find that there are many frameworks out there for transitions. If you talk about taxonomies, there are also many taxonomies out there. But the problem is there is no clarity. And this is not just a problem for the funders, it's also a problem for those seeking capital. Because if they don't understand what qualifies them to be eligible for finance, whether it's transition finance or whether it's green finance, they don't know how to configure their businesses. They don't know how to configure their projects. And of course, there's a huge lack of capacity in transition finance. This goes all the way from the users of the finance, the providers of the finance, to the regulators themselves. An important thing that's often forgotten is the weak project pipeline. And the weak project pipeline is a result of all the things I mentioned just now. Because there's no clarity on getting finance, naturally both the demand and supply become a lot weaker. So what are we doing about this? Well, the financial sector regulators in Southeast Asia have actually come together. They've thought very hard about it, and they've put out different roadmaps on how we're going to promote sustainable finance in Southeast Asia. Because whether we're talking about greening, whether we're talking about transitioning, the key is actually money. So the capital market regulators have come up with 2 documents. The first is the ASEAN Capital Market Forum's roadmap for ASEAN sustainable capital markets. The second is a report by the Working Committee on Capital Market Development on promoting sustainable finance in ASEAN. Now, the WCCMD report is actually coming from a group of regulators and policymakers comprising capital market regulators, central banks, and ministries of finance. So there's a fairly holistic approach to the capital market space. The central banks have also come up with a report. It's titled The Report on the Roles of ASEAN Central Banks in Managing Climate and Environment-Related Risks. I'll summarize the reports for you. Essentially, the 2 capital market reports have 31 recommendations. The central bank report also has very similar trusts, and you can distill it to 4 priority areas. The first is to create an ASEAN sustainable finance taxonomy, because we need a common language. The second is to enable transition by providing clarity, and that means having to create a transition finance framework. The third is on disclosures, because if you have a taxonomy, you have transition standards, but you don't have the disclosures to support them, it's not very much use. Now, once you have these 3 pillars in place, you need to have pushed the lever to strengthen demand and supply in a mutually reinforcing manner. I talked about transition, and the topic of this conversation is about transition. In Southeast Asia, we're looking for a just transition, but not just we're looking for a just and affordable transition. The central banks have made it very clear in their report, which was, by the way, released in 2020, that you need a gradual and phased approach in this part of the world, right? And The reason is because you don't want to create social and economic dislocations. The capital market regulators share the same view. They felt very strongly that it's important to take into consideration the diversity of our members and therefore approach the possibility of using tiered approaches rather than a linear single approach so that we can bring all countries on this sustainability journey. And importantly, they also recognize that it's really hard to get to the perfect. And while we spend so much time talking about perfect, we are missing on doing good in the meantime. Don't forget, we have a tipping point. And so some progress is better than no progress, but we have to make sure that this is not greenwashing and it is real effort. At Sophia, which is the institute I come from, we also look at building the 3 pillars of the sustainable finance ecosystem. So to us, the most important thing is actually to build a sustainable finance ecosystem to have a consistent, credible flow of funds. And of course, that sustainable finance ecosystem comprises the 3 pillars I spoke of just now: taxonomy, transition, and disclosures, and that lever of strengthening demand and supply to create a virtuous cycle. But we need both official frameworks and we need market action. So we need regulatory support and discipline and market support and discipline as well. Along the way, we've got to address things like awareness. We've got to address things like the attractiveness of returns and the risk, capacity, as I mentioned just now, the ability to coordinate within the private sector and the official sectors and between the two of them, and as well as closing the policy and market gaps. What are the transition elements that we really need to look at? Well, if you look at the sources of finance, they're quite clear. It's the private capital providers, it's the multilateral development banks, it's the philanthropies and the governments. But how do we bring all this funding to come together in a way that optimizes for ASEAN? Well, the first, as I mentioned just now, is that we should have very clear frameworks to empower the flow of capital. But on top of those frameworks, what we also need are policy drivers. And these policy drivers actually come in the form of things like carbon pricing, which some of the countries in Southeast Asia are trying to do. Importantly, we need to remove subsidies that are misallocated. We need to have energy policies that are sensible. And importantly, we need to provide transition assistance. Many people don't realize this, but we have over 70 million MSMEs in Southeast Asia. There's the question of competitiveness. There's the question of survival. If we want the MSMEs to transition and they form the backbone of the ASEAN economies, we must give them assistance. Whether this assistance comes in the form of capacity, whether it comes in the form of direct financial support, whether it comes in the form of technical support, or whether it comes in the form of tax credits, it's absolutely important we do this. We also then have to provide a range of instruments to enable the capital to flow. Those instruments can come in the form of debt, like sustainability-linked bonds or sustainability-linked loans, equity. We need de-risking. I think de-risking is something people often forget about because a lot of the sustainable finance projects actually need financing in the local currency, especially the social projects. Can kind of form grants, blended finance, which is very important, soft loans, and also structures to help the early retirement of coal. So how far have we come? In between late 2017 and 2018, the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum had its first attempt at providing a common definition. So it issued 3 standards: the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, the ASEAN Social Bond Standards, and the ASEAN Sustainability Bond Standards. These were based on the sister ICMA standards, but adapted for use in Southeast Asia. For example, they did not allow the use of proceeds towards fossil fuel projects. Now, that was specifically mentioned. How have these standards done? Well, actually, they've done remarkably well because as at January this year, about 39 billion US dollars of issuances have labeled themselves under one of these 3 standards. And also, interestingly, last year, the trend shifted towards an issuance of sustainability bonds. So of the labeling that was done last year using these three standards, 81% of the value was labeled under the sustainability bond standards. Now, these standards obviously help transition as well. I also talked about taxonomy, and it's absolutely important that we do have a common language. If we don't have a common language, it becomes very hard for investors to orient capital towards sustainability projects and for users of capital to be able to showcase the sustainability of their projects. So the ASEAN Taxonomy Board was established on the 31st of March 2021 under the auspices of the ASEAN Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting. The AFMGM, as we call them, was quite specific. They wanted the ASEAN taxonomy to be the overarching guide for all member states, complementing their respective national sustainability initiatives and serving as ASEAN's common language for sustainable finance. So what does that mean? It means that all member states can have their own taxonomies at the national level to address national priorities and national agendas. But the ASEAN taxonomy will be the consolidating taxonomy. And importantly, as I mentioned just now, and you may have noted, there was an emphasis that because our member states are so different and diverse, a single tier approach may not work. So the finance ministers and central bank governors advocated a multi-tiered taxonomy that will be able to take into account all the different starting points of our member states and therefore be inclusive. But they also wanted this taxonomy to be in line with international aspirations and goals so that it's interoperable, and also importantly to facilitate an orderly and effective transition towards a sustainable ASEAN. Version 1 of the ASEAN taxonomy was released in November 2021. It featured some very interesting things. Firstly, it was a two-tiered taxonomy. There was a foundation framework, which is principles-based, and this was useful for countries who were at a stage where they didn't have the right data to immediately use a quantitative-based framework. But along with that principles-based framework came a technical screening criteria-based framework called the Plus Standard, which countries that are ready can use. And what is important to note is that there are two features in this taxonomy that support transition. The first is in the foundation framework, which is the principles-based framework. Remedial measures to transition is recognized. This means that it allows companies and countries to start undertaking projects that may not immediately fit the perfect bill, but they have to take remedial measures to transition. That allows and facilitates transition projects. The second is you will notice that there is an amber category, whether it's through the foundation framework or the Plus Standard. That amber category reflects a transition category. Now, in this taxonomy, transition is not a dirty word. It is something that's real and that needs to be financed, and the taxonomy recognizes that. On top of that, the taxonomy also allows that transition also takes time. So if you notice, the EU taxonomy has one single threshold, and if you meet the threshold, you're eligible under the taxonomy. If you don't meet it, you're not eligible. The ASEAN taxonomy in the Plus Standard has three screening criteria, three thresholds for each screening criteria, I would say, because what it does is that it allows people to come in at the starting point they're at and quickly move up or plot the pathway for themselves to move up to the ultimate ambition, which is aligned to the global ambition. So in effect, the three thresholds within every economic activity allows people to create a pathway for their transitions. And this is how it's going to look like. The most advanced tier, tier 1, is actually aligned to international ambition. We know that some people won't be able to meet tier 1, but they're on their way there. So we classify them as tier 2. And there are people who are trying, but still not at tier 2 yet. So we classify them as tier 3. And what we want them to do is to adopt the tier that suits them and look for a way to move as quickly as possible to tier 1, which is the international ambition. Right, so as I end, I just wanted to talk about some of the pathways we need to really put effort into to be able to finance the transition journey for Southeast Asia. The first is we need to put more emphasis on transition finance and the different variations that come up from it, including co-phase-out financing. We need to take advantage of blended finance, which we have been seeing advances in, but possibly not enough at this point. Islamic finance is very, very congruent with sustainable finance, and there's an opportunity to use Islamic finance as a frame to bring more capital in. We need more innovative structures like debt for nature swaps. And we're also at a stage where we need to focus on the SDGs, because no transition can be complete if we're ignoring the SDG aspects. So it is important to also focus on SDG bonds. Importantly, it's necessary for us to always consider green debt traps. And that's important because it is unfortunate that the most vulnerable countries also have the highest cost of capital. And that's why I talked about the need to have de-risking mechanisms just now. So put together, no one single solution is going to work to support transition, but we need a battery of solutions coming together to operate in a seamless manner to drive the agenda. So with this, I just wanted to end to say that the ACMF has issued some guidance on the areas that I was talking about. The first is an SDG bond toolkit that was issued last year in October. This was issued the year before, and in October last year, the SDG toolkit was supplemented by legal wrappers for every country that talks about the legal conditions in every country to issue SDG bonds. The ASEAN Capital Markets Forum also issued a guidance on ASEAN Sustainability-Linked Bond Standards and ASEAN Sustainable and Responsible Fund Standards in October last year. So with that, I shall end. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Eugene, for an excellent presentation. And thank you very much as well for keeping on time. We now have a Q&A round. So if anyone wishes to ask a question based on what Eugene has said, please raise a hand if you're a panelist, or otherwise indicate that you wish to ask a question. I can ask 2 questions on my side, given that I don't see anybody else asking a question. So the first one is that, I think that we face significant challenges in the transition to net zero, given that we still see a lot of investment in fossil fuels and subsidies towards these fossil fuel dependent sectors. Is this something that you see as more of a short-term situation, given developments that have taken place in 2022? And, what is the trajectory for longer-term investment in sustainable and away from fossil fuels? So that's one thing, the nature of investment in fossil fuels that we see at the moment and the trajectory away from that. The second point is relation to, you mentioned a number of instruments that can be conduits for financing the transition to net zero, such as various types of de-risking mechanisms, including blended finance, sustainability-linked bonds, etc. Are there particular types of instruments that are better than others as conduits for sustainable finance? Does it depend on economies, structure of the economy in terms of employment and sectoral breakdown, for example? Does it depend on the level of financial development? The taxonomy is obviously an important factor as well. So I'd like to get your views on those 2 issues, please.
Thank you, John. Those are both excellent questions. Let's talk about the stopgap measures that have been taken with the energy crisis. So there are 2 schools of thought about this. The first is actually a school of thought that worries that short-term measures end up being long-term measures because it's just convenient and it's cheap and it's politically popular. So that's one area that we have to worry about. Related to that is the issue of lock-in. So during this period of uncertainty, investments may be made to ensure energy security, to ensure affordability, and that social goals are being met. Now, the problem is that many of these projects aren't 5-year, 10-year projects. They can be 20-year, 30-year, 40-year projects. That creates a risk of lock-in because what happens if you have these projects, you build, and you have to operate them for a longer period of time. They either become stranded, impaired, or you close an eye and you let them continue, and the lock-in is there, and you miss the tipping points that we're looking at. The good news is that last week, I think the IEA released a report to say that the emissions levels last year were actually lower than expected, despite all of this happening. And that is due to a massive buildup of renewables, coupled with, of course, a slowdown in economic growth in some countries. But I think the issue we have to concentrate on here is really, has the energy crisis encouraged more renewables? And the answer is actually yes, it has. I think it has sped up the construction and development of more renewable facilities, and therefore we see something positive coming out of that. The problem, as I mentioned just now, is that in the short term, while the facilities come online, what do you do? Because it's not just about the facilities, it's also about things like transmission and distribution systems. Some of them are antiquated. We face problems like curtailment on the more the older systems. So we're talking about an infrastructure upgrade. We're talking about new infrastructure coming in to support renewables. In the meantime, you've got to provide the energy security to meet a growing population and growing economies. So what do you do? So the trick here is to ensure that you build things that don't lock in, whether you can retrofit them or whether they're shorter term solutions, you try and achieve those. I was actually on a call today with some businesses in the region, and the thing that I felt bothered me, but I also expected, was that when some of these companies bring transition projects to a financial institution, and the financial institution has the option of looking and financing a straight green project, they will go for the wind or solar project. Of course, that's easy and everyone's competing for the wind and solar projects, but it means we're ignoring transition. This means that we have to start looking at how we can make transition easier and more acceptable. The fact of the matter is that the way FIs account for their investments and their funding, even if you are funding something that's in the long term going to reduce emissions, but it's producing emissions in the short term, that's going to add up to the emissions balance sheet. So this is something that is of worry because it seems to be impeding the investments, and we have to find a way around it. Your second question on which instruments work best, again, I think you answered the question when you asked it. It depends on the type of projects or the companies that are issuing it, and different instruments will fit different folks. So if you are a company trying to transition, obviously a sustainability linked bond is good. It gives you some leeway there. If you have a project that's strictly green, then of course it would be good to get the green financing, whether it's through a green bond or whether it's through Islamic finance. So again, that is very specific to the purpose of the financing and the borrower itself.
Okay, Eugene, thank you very much for these answers. I think some very interesting insights there, particularly on the impact of the energy crisis. I think, so what you're saying basically is that it has accelerated the shift to renewable in some sense. Yes. And in fact, in this way, it's one of the positive outcomes of the energy crisis as economies seek to diversify the energy supply network. We've come to the end of your keynote speech timing. So thank you very much once again. And yes, we will now move to the paper session.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. So we will now turn to the first presentation in session 2 of the event, which is entitled Financing the Transition to Net Zero. The first speaker will be Suisa Ariaprucia, who is the head of sustainability research at the Pui Ung Pakorn Institute for Economic Research in Thailand. Apologies for my pronunciation. So you have, how long is the presentation? 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes to present, and then there will be discussion and Q&A. So Suisa, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me share my slides. Okay. And all right. So first of all, I'd like to thank you everyone very much today for having me here today to present the paper on sustainable finance in Southeast Asia. So this paper is actually written in collaboration with Professor Ulrich Waltz from SOAS, the University of London. And, we wanted to really look into the kind of, what are the developments, in the region, in ASEAN, like Eugene mentioned just now, ASEAN has a lot of developments have happened over the past few years. And, financing is something that is very important in order to drive the transition going forward. And, this is, we want there's a lot of significant developments, both at the country level, both at the regional level, and also at the multilateral level. And so this paper is really kind of reviewing what has happened in the past 6-7 years, and also discussing the developments across, ASEAN level, and also looking at the policy challenges and the recommendations that are going forward. So as we can see, in this graph by the German Watch Global Climate Risk Index, we see that in the ASEAN region, we have very high levels of climate risk. And if you look, closely, at the countries there, you can see that, Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines are all dark red, which means that we are in the top 1 to 10 countries globally that are at risk from climate. And other countries such as Cambodia, Vietnam are also red, slightly lighter shade of red than the first few countries, but still red nevertheless. And so if you look at this, you can see that half of the ASEAN is actually at very high levels of climate risk, and in the top 1 to 20 of the countries globally. And this is, as we mentioned, we can see that this risk, Myanmar is number 2, Philippines 4th, and Thailand 9th overall rankings from globally. You can see this affects not only the GDP or economic numbers, but it also affects fatalities and a lot of other social impacts as well on the inhabitants. And if you see this climate risk, the importance of it is that it not only has physical risk, but it also implies that there's risk to the macroeconomic as well as to the financial stability of the economies. And we can see this, as we have seen research from Waltz and Byrne, that this greater vulnerability to climate change has an effect on sovereign bond yields, and therefore it's actually more expensive for these countries that are exposed to climate risk in order to finance. And this can be a burden to the financing the transition, which we all know is very important if we really want to reach our climate goals going forward. And Eugene may have mentioned a bit of this, but I'd like to give an overview of what has these countries at the country level in Southeast Asia been doing over the past couple of years. So if you look at the 10 countries, we can see that from our review of the financing activities, we see that there's actually really kind of a two-tier difference, and this is really a difference in the pace and the scale of the progress that has been made. We see that on the right, countries, 7 countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam have really been, really accelerating and having a lot of progress in the areas of sustainable finance, whereas Brunei, Laos, Myanmar may have a bit of less progress. And this, as we know, is really because of not surprising, given the different levels of economic and social development, which Eugene also mentioned just now. And we have also the different institutional capacities and the different economic priorities of the economies. And so there is really kind of something that we have to take into account of Southeast Asia, that each economy, as we mentioned, is very different and have a different contextual landscape for each country. And if you look, and so how did these countries in Southeast Asia, really kind of take on approach to sustainable finance? And, looking at the review of, what measures that have been happened, we see that, initially this since 2015-16, at the start of the journey, it really was more of an industry-led approach. So, this is when What I mean by industry-led approach is that the financial regulators actually work together with the industry associations, the Association of Banks, to really kind of come up with guidelines and kind of a commitment in a way, and as to see what can be done with regards to having more responsible financing. And this approach is really, in a way, kind of to buy in the industry, so that it's not just an exercise where the financial regulators will say, we want you to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and if you comply according to what we tell you to do, it will be a checklist exercise. And so this is really kind of more discussion between the industry, the financial regulators, and which result in the guidelines that we see here from Singapore, Cambodia, and Thailand. And from my own experience, this is really, by working with the financial institutions in Thailand, this is really kind of the first discussion. At the beginning of the journey, many financial institutions were still asking, how is climate related to the financing activities of the financial institutions? And so when working on these principles and working together with industry, this really started the conversation, and it's really a first step in promoting sustainable finance. And you may ask, what is it in these guidelines that are so important, being issued by the industry guidelines? So they really kind of set out the scope, and really set out the principles that are important for having further sustainable finance activities, such as one, to make sure that this includes, ESG principles, environmental, social, governance standards, as well as looking at disclosures, looking at making sure there's policy and tone from the top, making sure there's governance, as well as stakeholder, as well as stakeholder engagement. And most importantly, these guidelines are published and signed by the industries. So they, in a way, they are sort of a commitment by the financial industries that they will take into consideration the ESG principles. And as we look at then we look to see what actually happened at the whole financial system level. Is there an ecosystem that is being built around sustainable finance? And what we discovered was that really the capital markets were really kind of the leaders in working on sustainable finance. So we saw Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand really kind of work together, having sustainable standards as well having grant schemes, and also waiving fees that are kind of important to help stimulate the issuance of green bonds. And then we see countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand that issued sovereign green and sustainability bonds, which is signaling to the market that we are giving importance to sustainable finance, and we want you to really kind of take on these new instruments. And as you can see, in Malaysia, we saw the first sustainable sukuk green bond, which was issued by Malaysia, as well as other sustainability linked bonds, that are promoted by the MAS. On the financial institution side, insurance side, so they were a bit later to the game, so maybe just a couple years to 3 years. And we really see, as mentioned earlier, what sort of, how can we have an ecosystem that is really supportive of sustainable finance? And we saw a number of clear communication guidelines coming out from at the country level. So each country may have different names. Some of them are called roadmaps, action plans, or initiatives. But basically, what they are is it's a document that really kind of give a clear communication to the financial industry that this is how we would like to see the development of sustainable finance practices going forward. What are the measures that you have to take in consideration when doing businesses, and also the building of key ecosystem elements, such as what are standards that are necessary. For example, taxonomies. We saw Eugene mentioned just now the importance of having taxonomies. Do we all understand what we consider to be green and what is not green? And also make sure that there are disclosure standards, so that there's information out there for both funders and people who need to seek funding. And most importantly, data, as well as to make sure that there is data available to everyone, and human capital. So this means that human capital here refers to training. So this is training for everyone in the financial industry and both industry players as well as the regulators. And we also see that, other than having clear guidelines on showing the direction of where we want to see the financial system going forward, there was also a lot of talk regarding risk assessments. So the financial industry, are working together closely, that we saw in the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, where they're actually working together now on having climate stress tests, as well as further integrating these guidelines into more regulatory management frameworks. So we can see now that, after around 6 years, the impetus have been stepped up, and there's actually more of a hybrid of regulatory approaches, rather than just the industry-led approach. So if you look at the ASEAN level, so, so just now earlier we were talking about at the country level, but, sustainable finance and the transition to net zero is something that has to happen, with everyone working together, so at a more cohesive and as a common approach. So we see this at the ASEAN level. So this is where all 10 countries of Southeast Asia are members. Initially, we had a lot of discussion on environment, but this was basically before under the pillar of the ASEAN social cultural community. But this is where we have the environmental regulators actually discussing environmental problems and issues, but it wasn't really yet linked into the financing. And so what we observed is that, more recently in the past 3 to 4 years, we see that the ASEAN Economic Community pillar, which is where all the financial regulators and the central banks, finance ministries, are working together on different issues of the economy, started really discussing the sustainable finance and the importance of working together to have this. And like at the country level, we saw that the capital markets really kind of led on this. And ASEAN as well, we see that, as Eugene mentioned just now, we see the issuance of many standards, green bond standards, social bonds, sustainability bond standards, as well as sustainability linked bond standards. These were all issued, since 2017, 2018 by the ASEAN committees in charge of capital markets. And, and further on, we have seen a continued development of ASEAN, standards regarding to the sustainable and responsible funds, as well as an SDG bond toolkit, which is really kind of a practical guide on how to issue bonds, to issuing SDG bonds in ASEAN. And these standards, are not served to only to be a practical guide, but they actually are kind of serves to educate the market, as well as to increase the capacity building of the financial players. So ASEAN is working together in a number of ways. We have the kind of these roadmaps to kind of guide you the direction. We have the toolkits, we have the guidelines that kind of actually give you the information on how to implement that. And then we also have at the country level, as mentioned earlier, we have incentives being given out by different countries, whether it be waivings of fees or filing fees, in order to encourage this capital market development. And on the financial side, we saw just now, we have development of other important elements that are conducive to sustainable finance, such as the taxonomies as well, the green map, which will be looking at a high level perspective of what actions are being undertaken in ASEAN as a whole, and actually kind of looking at how can we actually complement and actually unify the efforts with regards to sustainable finance. And as we all know, that human capacity is also important, and with ASEAN working together on developing at the same time the human capacity of the ASEAN region. So this is not only for the regulators, but also for the industry players. And as you can see, the ASEAN really has been working, looking everything in a more cohesive framework, and everything is being done together in parallel. So it's to make sure that the speed is up to speed. But of course, this is something that cannot be done, achieved alone. So we see at the regional level, as well as the country level, really, you see a lot of collaboration between different stakeholders. For example, we have, training that's being offered by CSAN. We have the network for greening the financial system, which 7 out of 10 members are 7 out of 10 ASEAN countries are members of the NGFS. And so really learning from other countries, in the world about what actions are being undertaken for sustainable finance. And also, events like today's, research is actually very important in order to scaling up the know-how with regards to sustainable finance. And, so we saw just now a number of initiatives that have been working, that have been achieved both at the country level, both at the regional level. But, has this really had desired outcomes and impacts on the bond markets? The information for the lending data is a bit scarce. So we have here data on kind of the issuance of bonds. And this is from the Climate Bonds Initiative. We see that over the past 6 years, there really has been continued, really kind of significant rise in the issuance of green bonds and sustainability bonds. And we can really see that, we have in 2021, there's really a kind of record high of over $24 billion of issuance of green, sustainability, and social bonds. And if you look at the graph on the right, we can see that, in ASEAN, the issuances by type, green bonds are still at the moment leading. But as we see, now the rise of sustainability bonds have also been increasing at a very rapid pace. And this in part has really been, due to the issuance of guidelines in ASEAN. The green bond standards were one of the first standards to be coming out, and then followed by sustainability guidelines. So with these guidelines in place, they really kind of facilitate, the issuance of bonds by the market. And if you look by country, of course, we see that Singapore is really leading in this area, and as well as followed by Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. And, this is something that we will see continued trend to go as financial regulators and countries continue to work on actually incentivizing the issuance of these bonds. And if you look at the annually issuance in ASEAN 6 countries, we see that in 2021, we see that every year, what's important about this graph is that you see every year, there has been significant increase in the issuance. And even despite during the, a very challenging years of the pandemic, the past 2 years, there has still continued to be a rise in the issuance of these bonds. And, I like to end, we see, as Eugene mentioned, and as we also see across the ASEAN, it is a very challenging kind of landscape going forward. We see there's uneven progress across the different jurisdictions. This, as we know, is due to the different, economic and social development of each country. But and if you look at the survey of from the ASEAN member states, we also found that some of the obstacles, that are really kind of hindering the progress, are really kind of the lack of funding. 5 out of 8 member countries mentioned there's a lack of funding in this area. There are some technical capacity gaps. So, and people who work in sustainable finance are still really quite, it's still not enough for the industry. So Singapore is one of the countries that mentioned they have a still need to build up on this area of technical capacity gaps. And so other countries, Singapore is already very advanced in the financial sector. So other countries also really have these big issues with technical capacity gaps, awareness, as well as data. So data is important because at the moment, with regards to the transition going forward, with regards to sustainability, there's really not much reliable or comparable data, and and that is really needed in order to really push this transition going forward. Of course, the transition will have to be something that's gradual and phased going forward, but this is something that requires really the coordination between multiple stakeholders. And this is a challenge because for the first time, the central banks or the financial regulators are not only working together with the financial industries, but they also have to work together with other government regulators who look at the environment, who look at the energy sector or the power sectors. So this is really coordination between the whole of government. And this is really a challenge, I think, for many countries going forward. And, if you look at the revision of the government structures, our economies in ASEAN have really been designed for the old kind of economy. So the laws, the regulations will need to not only be updated, but they may have to be revised, and the way that, the coordination between the governance have to really kind of be reconsidered. So these are really kind of big issues. Data frameworks is not just financial data now, but the financial sector also needs to have access to environmental data, and these really are big challenges going forward, and for the Southeast Asian region. So I'll end the presentation here.
Thanks very much, Susa, for an excellent and very informative presentation. We will now have a discussion, and the discussant is Lethai Ha, who's Managing Director of Vin Future Prize at the Vin Future Foundation, Vietnam. After this discussion of around 8 minutes, we will have 7 minutes for Q&A. So please, as usual, somehow indicate that you wish to ask a question. I will now hand over to Lethai Ha to give the discussion of this of the previous paper. So go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. All right. So a very good day to everyone. And my name is Thai Ha. I'm from Vin Future Prize Foundation, and that is a global prize in science technology from Vietnam. And thanks, Dr. Suisa, for your very informative presentation. It is my pleasure to be assigned as the discussion of your paper, and I'd like to share my comments in detail. So first of all, the paper highlights the importance of sustainable finance in the region, and where the environmental and social impacts of economic growth and development have become increasingly apparent. The authors provide a comprehensive overview of the current state of sustainable finance in Southeast Asia and explore the potential for further growth and development. One of the strengths of this paper, it is holistic approach to sustainable finance, which consider both the environmental and social aspect of sustainability. The authors provide a detailed analysis of the various sustainable finance instruments and frameworks that are being used in the region, including green bonds, social bonds, and sustainability-linked loans. They also highlight the challenge. That need to be addressed, such as the lack of standardization and transparency in the market. Moreover, the papers also provide insights into the policy and the regulatory landscape for sustainable finance in Southeast Asia. The authors identify various initiatives being taken by the government, central bank, and financial regulators to promote sustainable finance, such as the issuance of green bonds by the government in Asia and the establishment of green finance center in Malaysia and Singapore. These efforts are commendable and can help create a very enabling environment for sustainable finance to thrive. Now I'd like to share some aspects that I believe can be improved further. First of all, I think the papers can be improved by ensuring that the introduction provide a clear explanation of the concept of sustainable finance and its importance. This can be achieved by outlining the key features of sustainable finance and how it contributes to sustainable economic, social, and environmental development. Additionally, the introduction should provide a comprehensive overview of how sustainable finance has been implemented so far around the world. This may include examples of successful sustainable finance initiatives, as well as the challenges faced in implementing sustainable finance practices. Furthermore, it will be beneficial it would be beneficial for the current study to highlight the contribution of the study or the originality of the study in the introduction. This could be achieved by clearly stating the research question, right, the objective of the study, as well as the methodology and approach taken to address those problems. So the introduction should also highlight the potential implication of the study findings for sustainable finance practice and the policy. Also, the study can enhance its analysis by comparing ASEAN levels initiative on sustainable finance to those of other regionals globally or the global average. So this comparative analysis can provide valuable insight into the effectiveness of sustainable finance initiative within the ASEAN region. Also, the study can conduct an in-depth analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of this initiative, which can inform the development of future policies and practices in sustainable finance within ASEAN and even beyond that. By including this element, I believe the study can provide a more comprehensive and understanding of sustainable finance initiative within ASEAN region. The papers will also benefit from a more in-depth analysis of this case study, right? More in-depth case study that provide concrete examples of how sustainable finance is being implemented in practice. While the papers present a comprehensive overview of the various sustainable finance instruments and framework in Southeast Asia, it would be helpful to also provide more detailed examples of successful projects that have been financed using this instrument. This would make the paper more engaging and help the readers gain a better understanding of the practical application of sustainable finance in Southeast Asia. So to provide a more detailed analysis, it would be useful to explain some critical observations from the graph presented in the study. I find that this study have many helpful, interesting graphs and statistics, but I think it would be more helpful, more informative if the authors can explain some of the key observations. For instance, in this figure, the study may want to explore further why Malaysia has a comparatively lower performance in terms of cumulative GSS issuance, but right, compared to other ASEAN countries. Because we know Malaysia is in the group of upper middle income countries. So why it's have a relatively low performance in this regard? Also in the figure 4, I think figure 4 could benefit from a more detailed discussion to provide a deeper analysis of the data. The study may report on the observation and trends authored in the graph, right, and explore the factors that contribute to the differences in the data across different years and the countries. The study can identify potential factors that contribute to these differences, such as the regulatory framework, such as the market condition, and also the investor demand, right? So in summary, I think that this paper provides a very useful overview of the current state of sustainable finance in ASEAN and the potential for further growth and development. The author's holistic approach and insights into the policy and regulatory landscape are particularly helpful and noteworthy. While more case study would have been helpful, the paper also provide a very solid foundation for further research and analysis in this important area, this very trendy area. So thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, and here's my contact details in case of need.
That's great. Thank you very much, Thai Ha, for this discussion. Some very important points made. We now have a Q&A round. Before I hand back to Suisa, who can have a response to some of the points made, I have a question myself. So in Suisa's presentation, she highlighted different levels of GSS issuance across some Asian economies, and this was also touched on by the discussant. But I think that what was presented were the absolute levels in US dollars, and it would be of interest to look at a scaled version of those numbers relative to GDP across countries, because this would allow for a more valid comparison of the levels across countries. Although, you know, one would expect that Singapore would still, even looking at a per capita share, to be out in front given its level of financial development. But it would be interesting to see whether your findings hold when looking at scaled versions of these GSS issuances relative to GDP. That's just basically a comment on that. So I would now like to hand the floor to Suisa, who can spend 3 or 4 minutes, let's say, on your overall response to my comment and the comments by the discussant. So go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Hay and Mr. John Byrne, for your comments. So, definitely I agree with you that, if we really explain a bit more really on the concept of sustainable finance and why it's important, as well as maybe look at other case studies, I think this would be something that we can add. So the concept of sustainable finance is really something that's also another very big topic, and that's also evolving. So I think that is something that could definitely be added onto the paper. And we can also look at why, comparing ASEAN to different other regions. So I think if we do that, the approach, we will probably be looking onto the European as well region that have been doing a lot of sustainable financing activities, and really because it's also an integrated region, so we can see the similarities to ASEAN, but it's also very different levels of development and different historical backgrounds. So that, I think that would be something that we could definitely put on into the further studies. And you mentioned, to look in practice about how this is actually to see some practical successful projects, I think. And I think that will be, in ASEAN, we have a lot of kind of successful projects that are based on the social aspects as well as on the green. And we can see that the sovereign issuances sometimes are more for infrastructure projects as well as for the social aspects. So I think that would be something we could work on. And to look at, and as Mr. John mentioned, we could perhaps scale it to GDP. I think that's something definitely would be interesting, because as you mentioned, each country has a very different kind of socio-economic development, and that is something that we will would be better reflected in the GDP. So definitely we'll take these comments in for the further works going forward. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Suisa, and thank you again, Taiha, for your comments on the paper. We will now move to the second paper of this session, which will be presented by Dr. Hadian Akyar, who is an accounting lecturer at the Mae Fa Luang University in Thailand. And his paper is entitled Climate Change Breakthrough, Renavigating Indonesia's Budgeting. So please go ahead, Dr. Akyar. You have 20 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much, John. So yeah, I really would like to emphasize the importance of our meeting today, where we share ideas and we'd like to elevate our knowledge and our expertise and the possible solution to reach the sustainable finance. Because recently I just come back from Sydney, where researchers from 17 countries talking about on how we can achieve blue economy. And then we realized that achieving renewable energies, achieving any green technologies for our sustainable economy is almost impossible without a sustainable finance. So it's not a one-time finance, it's not one-time financing. We need to think how it can make really like endless financing process or procedures. So then, I really would like to say thank you for Asian Development Bank, thank you for Asian Development Bank Institute, and thank you for University of London, SOAS, for giving us, the researchers, policymakers, and government officers to share ideas in these online platforms. So then, I would like to begin my presentation today. So Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin, wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi washabbihi ajmain amma ba'd. Okay, so today I and Kiki would like to present to you the papers entitled "Climate Change Breakthrough: Re-Navigating Indonesia's Budgeting Pathway in Transition to Climate Budget Taking." So this the focus of this paper is on how we would like for the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Indonesia to incorporate the concept or the approach of climate budget taking. Because you know that's in Indonesia itself, that based on the country report alone, in 2008 and 2009, the sea level has risen up to 0.8 meters. So then I think Indonesia in many other countries, especially in the Pacific Islands as well, we are facing a serious threat to sinking cities, because of the rising sea levels. Then yes, many cities on the coastlines are now in the threats of going to sink. So that's why then in one of the coastline cities in Cirebon in Indonesia, we have estimated there is a loss of 0.29 trillion Indonesian rupiah, or it's around $500,000 US, because of these sinking cities of this, which resulted from the climate change itself. So then it's very urgent now for any governments, including in Indonesia, to incorporate the climate budget tagging in their environmental protection. Because next, during my explanation, I will show you how that the current environmental budgetings is good, but not good enough. Okay. Yeah. So so far, the agenda, the way Indonesian governments creates their environmental budgeting is based on the try to mimic the international environmental budgeting methods. So then the contribution are configured by the subnational government, assisted by the national government to monitor and verify them. So the subnational governments, or maybe we can say the provinces or territories or states within Indonesia, or we call that as the provinces, they will give suggestions, and then the central governments will approve the environmental budget. And so far, nationally, each province in Indonesia, and now it's around 34 provinces. Now, we agree on achieving a reduced carbon emission by 31.89%. And also the environmental budget itself on how we can tackle the carbon emissions coming from the government's regulations. So each province has its independency in setting their environmental budget. So the central governments only approve for the final budget. And so far, the framework that we are using right now is Climate Public Expenditure Institutional Review. There's nothing wrong with this framework, but in these occasions, we would like to encourage the governments to push further, to use more advanced methodology called as the CBT, or climate budget tagging, because CBT offers a framework to understand how planning and budgeting correlate to monitoring and tracking of climate-related expenditure in the budgetary systems. So then this CBT framework has life cycles in its environmental budgeting systems. So then we can have that planning and evaluations with more comprehensive view, it's like a helicopter view. And also this is that each province mainly address on its environmental budgeting. So it's coming from the natural resources protection, the agriculture, energy, transportation, education, and other supporting policies. So then we begin our research on trying to build the hypothesis. So first, we believe that there is a correlation between environmental budgets and environmental quality itself. So of course, it's not enough to only imposing laws and regulations, but governments in Indonesia also use fiscal instruments. So it's like a stick and carrots. So it's like reward and punishment. So we encourage, we stimulate like green activities, and we discourage the environmentally unfriendly activities. So we believe that there is a positive relationship between environmental budget and environmental quality. And also, we also believe that because the budgeting is audited by auditors, so that's why we believe there is a growing importance. We cannot neglect the importance of auditors' opinion, because they are the one who audit the budgeting itself. So then whether the budget can be approved or not, they have the influence. The auditors have influence. So that's why previously auditors and accountants have not typically been linked to the environmental or conservation movements, but they are the center of informations in almost organizations, whether it's private or public organizations. They are the right hand of the decision makers. In private companies, the accountants are the right hand of the CEO, which they usually call as the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. Usually, CEO will consult, will discuss with their CFO when they want to execute a project, because of course any project requires budget. And the one who knows whether the budget is efficient or not are the accountants. So now we believe that the accountants and auditors who are dealing with the budgeting process will have a moderating effect. Yes, so this is our hypothesis number 2. So yeah, we use this panel data approach to see the impact of the environmental budget to the environmental quality, and also the impact of the auditor's opinion as independent variable and as the moderating variable. And also we do the same to the different dependent variable. In this case is Y2 is the carbon emission. So we have 2 dependent variables which we regress separately. So this is the results. So yes, I mean, of course, it's totally makes sense, because budget will make our environmental quality better. More budget on environments, we will have a better or healthier environments. Yes, in all islands in Indonesia, showing positive relationship. Then when we incorporate the auditor's opinion, so in this diagram, the auditor's opinion still as the independent variable, not a moderating variable yet. So yes, so we see there is a positive relationship to the environmental quality, but it does not happen in Sumatra. You see that the most left, the western part of Indonesia, that's Sumatra Island, it's not significant. It's not negative, but it's not significant. Auditor's opinion is not significant in Sumatra. Of course, many interpretations. There is no one single answer why. There is no one single interpretation on this one. But if I can personally interpret why, maybe there is a growing, or maybe there is a harsh conflict of interest happening in Sumatra. So that's why auditor's opinion cannot really influence the environmental quality in Sumatra. And now the auditor's opinion act as the moderation effect. So in Sumatra, the moderation effect is good. So audit opinion on budget reporting can significantly emphasize the importance of environmental budgeting to improve environmental quality. But the difference is that in Sumatra, it's positive moderating forces. So then the environmental budget can influence the environmental quality. So it's positive moderating effect. So which we can interpret that the recommendations given by the auditors can lead to effective decision-making in Sumatra. But it happens differently. So this is where things got interesting and confusing at the same time. In Sulawesi, the moderating forces is negative. So maybe again, if we as the authors can interpret this phenomenon, so maybe there are misinterpretations or misallocations which from the auditors' recommendations about the environmental budgeting process, which leads to a worsened environmental quality happening in Sulawesi. Yeah. So Sulawesi, this minus 34.4. So that's Sulawesi Island. So when we talk about the environmental budget effect on carbon emissions, so in this diagram, this is the second dependent variable, the Y2, carbon emissions. So because carbon emission is nationwide, so this diagram is the result is nationwide. So nationwide, environmental budget can increase more budgets on the environment can increase the carbon emissions. So again, this is another interesting and also confusing or counterintuitive facts at the same time, because how more budget on environment, but it emits higher carbon emissions. So then again, there might be a possible activities that are financed, that are funded by the national environmental budgets, which are counterproductive. So that's why from this diagram, we as the authors would like to suggest the methodology, the approach of climate budget taking. So then we can ensure that the activities that are funded by our national environmental budgets can really give a good effect towards our environmental protection efforts. So then this kind of facts, we hope that it will not happen anymore when we think that our activities, our environmental protection activities are already good enough, but in fact, statistically, it shows different story. So we don't want this thing to happen anymore in the future. Because from this diagram, we see that auditors' opinion can indeed decrease the carbon emissions. So our opinion or recommendations from auditors can reduce the carbon emissions in total. So the recommendation from auditors regarding activities that should be funded by the environmental budgets, it's proven to be effective enough to reduce the carbon emissions. So that's why we the authors would like to suggest policies. First is a reform in the functions, responsibilities, and resources across subnational governments. We think already good that subnational governments, or we call that as provinces, they have independence or freedom to set their environmental priorities, but there should be a reform that can give spaces or opportunities for climate budget taking to take a part in their provincial environmental budgeting process. And second is, yeah, of course, we need more robust indicators to measure our outputs and outcomes. And also, yes, yeah, by this, we hope that we can immediately implement the climate budget taking among subnational governments. Yeah, because yeah, it's very important for us that we only have this one Earth that we should be that we should be kept. So then there is like a growing importance for us to also find a way on how we can finance this activities, these environmental protections with a more advanced ways, which we call that as climate budget taking. So then with this climate budget taking, we expect that in the futures that we can always measure the impact and the life cycle. So the importance of this climate budget taking is the life cycle of our environmental activities can be measured. So then we will not see that there are such counterproductive environmental activities which are funded by our taxpayer that cannot give a better outcomes. So then we believe that by this, Indonesia could have a better environmental budgeting processes if we can incorporate the climate budget takings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akyar, for a very policy relevant paper. I had a couple of questions myself on the empirical work, but before we get to the Q&A, I would like to invite the discussant of this paper, who is Dr. Ani Aryani, an associate professor at Universitas Sebelas Mare in Indonesia. She will have 8 minutes to provide a discussion. So I hand the floor to you, Dr. Aryani. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, John and everyone. Is my voice clear?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Let me share my comment. Okay. With slideshow. Okay.
Looks good. Thanks very much.
Yes.
Yep.
It is. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to discuss this interesting topic. The title will be the title of this paper is Climate Change Breakthrough: Renavigating Indonesia's Budgeting Pathway and in Transition to Climate Budget Taking, by Pak Zaki Hadian Ahar and Kiki Koifit. I would like to discuss this paper based on the way I usually review a paper from to international journal publication. So I will try to start this discussion with the originality of the paper. Does it add to the subject area or body of knowledge in any way? My answer is yes, because this is an interesting topic as the issue of global warming and environmental damage become increasingly critical to be responded to around the world. Real action have to be taken to combat the issue, including Indonesia, of course. If I'm not mistaken, in last year G20 meeting, Indonesia committed to always reducing emission until zero in the year of 2060. This commitment, of course, has to be supported by finance and clearly described in the budget. So the question in this topic is, what is the impact of the environmental budget on the environmental quality? So the second one is about the analytical rigor. Does the article demonstrate soundness in the way it has been researched and or argued? I will start this discussion with the hypothesis development. I think although the argument clearly develops, however, this research, I think, a bit lack of critical review of previous studies on the topic. For example, in the hypothesis 1, when the author argued that environmental budget will impact on environmental quality, the author tried to use some previous studies and concluded that the previous studies still find inconclusive result. However, there are no critical information about why the previous studies finding is not consistent and how the author can renew the relationship between the budget allocation for environmental and the environmental quality. I think if the author can criticize or finding why the previous result is not significant, then I think the author can improve the hypothesis that will develop. And for the hypothesis 2, I think there are even no previous research regarding the topic, why or how the audit opinion can moderate the relationship between budget allocation into the environmental quality. I think the critical review of previous research will strengthen the logic of the hypothesis development. And then from the methodology section, this is, I think, the author should clearly define each variable tested in this study and how the author measure it. Because I tried to read in detail about the paper, but I couldn't find how the author measure the variable. For example, how the author measure the budget allocation for environmental, and then how the author measure the environmental quality index, also the carbon emission, and also the audit committee, audit opinion in this. Also, the author didn't mention from what sources the data is gathered. So I think it is important to the author to mention this clearly. And then the other comment from me is that the author should clearly stated the population sample and sampling method that used in this study, of course, with the justification of it. And then from the result and discussion section, to be honest, I'm confused with table 7 and table 8, as I think the table 7 and table 8, it should be present the same same result, yeah, because table 7, I think, uses using the dependent variable with environmental quality index measurement, and the table 8, it should be using the second measurement with carbon emission. But I'm not sure, because in table 7, the author present the regression result based on each island, I think, yes, the biggest island in Indonesia. So I think the author should clearly mention what is the unit analysis in the study, with the province or islands level or country level. Because in description table, I think I'm forgot about the table. The table is mentioned about the country level, I think. So perhaps it will be better if the author clearly mentioned this problem. Also, I'm not so sure about the models 1, 2, and 3. It is referred to equation 1, 2, and 3 because I still confused because of there are no clear measurement about the variable. And then the next one is about the clarity and readability. I think, sorry to say, the paper needs to be proofread as it has many grammatical and structural mistakes that make it hard to be understood. The abstract is too long and confusing. My suggestion is that abstract is have to point out 3 important things, which is the aims of the study, the method employed, and the finding. And perhaps if you have implication, then you may present also in the abstract. So because your abstract is too long, so of course, I honestly a bit confusing. And then many long paragraphs make this manuscript hard to be understood, as it tends to have more than one idea in one paragraph. As a result, the reader will very easy to lose focus. And there are also many missing tables as mentioned in the body of the paper. For example, table 13.1, I tried to find it and I couldn't find it. Also, the way the author make a citation from previous study also have the different format from each paragraph. The other comment is all figures are hard to be read because perhaps you presented with a small figures. So actually, I couldn't conclude or make a conclusion or try to read the figures better. And then research application, I think yes, it is good that from the study, the authors were able to draw policy recommendation regarding the budget allocation towards zero emission. However, as I mentioned before, that before the author drawn the recommendation, I think better if the author respond first from all of the comments that I mentioned before. And then internationality, will the article be of interest to an international audience? I think yes, because as the object of the study is Indonesia, that is very important country regarding the environment, as Indonesia is located in the equator with huge forests and sea. Like what I present here, that Indonesia is the world largest island country, with the area is almost 2 million kilometers square, with island more than 17,000, and the population is around I think right now is perhaps reach almost 300 million. So that's all my comment for the study. Thank you very much. And time I pass again to John. Thank you, John.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ayani, for this excellent discussion. I think you've basically touched on some of the comments that I wish to make on the paper, which are largely around the robustness of the empirical results and the specification of the variable on the right-hand side of interest, which is the environmental budget. So I would be interested to know whether you have just taken the absolute value of that, or whether you have looked at that at a regional level, because of course that will have a role to play on specifying the impact of that on the left-hand side variable. Also, another point related to the specification is on variables that you have on the right-hand side, and whether do you have enough on the right-hand side to explain carbon emission and environmental quality. So I think on the right-hand side, you just have the environmental budget overall. I'm not sure whether it's scaled relative to the region, and you have some other measure of regional output as well. But of course, there are other factors which would be typical for explaining carbon emissions, which may not be picked up in your empirical model. So generally, the question is about the specification and the robustness of your results. So I think we have around 5 minutes left, 4 or 5 minutes. So I would like to hand the floor back to you, Dr. Akyar, to respond to the discussant and my comment. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much for the comments. Yeah, so yeah, I will improve my papers, yeah, such as from the lack of previous studies. Yeah, so I totally agree with that. So then, yeah, with sufficient previous studies, so I can claim my hypothesis. So I will work on that later. And also, yes, I will add explanations why previous studies are inconsistent. So then I can emphasize why this research interest, this research can provide a novelty on this matter. And also, yeah, I will also give further explanations and give definitions on the variables, population, sample, and sampling method. Yeah, so regarding the populations, yeah, so I think that from each cities in Indonesia, so that's why, yeah, the total of observations consists of 3,284 observations, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, because it's the observations comes from each cities, and it spans from the 3 years of my year of observations. So then, yeah, if we talk about the population, so the population represents all cities. So there is no cities in Indonesia that this research exclude. So all cities in Indonesia are observed in this research. So that's why I do not take any sampling methods, because then the all cities are in this research. And also, yeah, regarding some of the way I present the tables and figures, yeah, I will improve the way to increase the clarity and also the proofreading. Yes, I will work on that. And yes, I will also make my abstract more concise, so then it's more readable and it's easier for readers to digest. Yeah, so then, yes, regarding the specification of the model, yes, yeah, in this research, I use these environmental budgets, which is in total. So it's I transform the total of the environmental budgets in each cities, because yeah, I have access to the data of environmental budget of each city in Indonesia. So 34 provinces consists of, I think, around 250 something cities in Indonesia. And so the environmental budget is on each city. So then, yeah, it's in Indonesian rupiah, but I transform that into US dollars in order to get a better way to interpret the environmental budgets. And also regarding the auditor's opinion, yes. So again, yes, I will clarify where I get the data of auditors' opinions. But then, yeah, I would like to clarify here that the auditors' opinions that we take in this research is coming from the public auditors' opinions, the Supreme Audit Agency. Yeah, in Indonesia we call that as BPK. So yeah, I can say it's the Supreme Audit Agency. So it's government's auditors agency. And also, yes, in this, and regarding the dependent variables, well, for the environmental quality, yes, so I take it from the environmental quality index. Yeah, so I regress the data into the natural logarithm, yeah, because the index is in single digit number. So while the others are in US dollars, so I use the natural logarithm transformation to execute the regression analysis. And yes, for the carbon emission itself, yeah, I take the data from the World Bank data regarding the carbon emission in Indonesia. Yeah, because the carbon emission is based on the countries, so that's why on the specification model on the specification number 2, I use the nationwide regressions, because yeah, the carbon emission is based on countries. I don't have access to data about carbon emission in each cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your response. I think that if you manage to implement the revisions, it will be greatly beneficial to the quality of your paper. So thanks to the speakers so far. We will have a 20-minute break now and return for the final 2 papers at that point. So from 20 minutes, we will start again. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back to this conference. We have the final 2 papers for today. First paper will be by Dr. Qikui Lui, who's Professor of Finance at Ningbo University, People's Republic of China. Professor Lui, are you there?
Oh, yes.
So I will hand the floor to you for 20 minutes, and we will then have a discussion by Professor Tomoki Fuji, who is Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Economics at Singapore Management University. But first, I hand the floor to you, Professor Lee. Go ahead for 20 minutes. Sorry, yeah, I should say the title of the paper is Big Tech, Gender and Environmental Behavior. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Asian Development Bank, for organizing this conference and accepting our paper. And today I would like to present our joint paper entitled with Big Tech, Gender and Environmental Behavior. And the paper is co-authored by Professor Wang Song from China Europe Business School and Jiang Shaoyan from Zhejiang University. Okay. Firstly, I would like to say thanks to the ANT group for their support with the data for conducting our study. And the motivation of the paper, actually, as we all know, that's a climate change issue that is a fundamental social problem. And the question is, what are the factors that promote or impede the public awareness or engagement or environmental and behaviors that is, somehow that is unknown, and that calls for research that illuminates the social factors that affect the public awareness or public environmental behaviors. And in practice, so where we look at the gender issue, that is in practice, actually, there are global calls for participation, for women participation in the environmental governance, for example, the Paris Agreement, or in the corporate world, in the corporate governance, or in the capital market. There are calls for that women participation. But actually, if we look at the literature or the existing studies, actually there's a weak empirical evidence about whether women got a more environmental friendly behaviors. And that is the so-called attitude behavior gap. And mostly this is called by what we call the participation constraint. That is, although probably you got more concerns or more environmental awareness, but actually due to the constraints that you cannot, behave more environmental friendly. So that calls for, if we want to that calls for research that is done with the setting that the participation constraint is greatly elevated. So that's why actually in this study we focus on a big tech initiative that is launched by the ANT group, that is assumption. So we use the setting provided by ANT group, the big data with the big tech platform. And what we do is first we focus on big tech and its implication to individuals' environmental behaviors. So our first question we want to answer is whether the big tech plays a role by incentivizing individuals to participate more in the environmental issue. And the second one is actually whether that there is a gender difference within this setting. So about the AAF, we call it AAF, that is referred to the Alipay Ant Forest. Okay, that is an initiative launched by the Alipay, by the Ant Group. Now we call Ant Group. Actually, this is something that actually, if you got a mobile phone, you got Alipay within that. Actually, you can use it. That is a function that is easily to use. Actually, that record your your green behaviors that we define as green behaviors, or that reflect your lifestyles, whether your lifestyles got a low or high carbon emission every day. Okay, so if your behavior is somehow low carbon emissions, you save the carbon emissions, then you can accumulate energy points. With that energy points, you can choose to spend your energy points to plant a virtual tree on the platform. Actually, then the Ant group would arrange to plant a real tree. If you plant a virtual tree in that platform, the Ant group will plant a real tree in the area at risk of desertification. So that means, as you can see, this AAF function that actually allow you to transfer your saved carbon emission up to real environmental behaviors. Okay, so we can see the major advantages of AAF. The first one is okay, it's easy to join and easy to participate. You can you actually don't need to do anything, just got a mobile phone and you open your AAF, then your behavior would be recorded, right? You allow the app to record your behavior, then that's all. So it is easy to participate, and you can participate anytime, anywhere with no cost. Okay, so just share your data on the everyday activities with Alipay so that you can participate in that. So we believe that this thing that greatly elevate the participation constraint. Okay, because in your real life, actually, if you want to do the environmental behaviors, actually it is costly. For example, you need to plant a real tree, right? So that, but within this setting, you don't need, right? You just plant a virtual tree, and that would become a real tree, right? So the idea is actually use the big tech or the technology to combat the climate change, right? So about our main finding, actually, first we found that okay, the participation rate is really great. For example, we find in our sample, actually over 82.6 individuals, actually they are users of AAF, and probably some of them do not plant trees, but actually they opened the AAF, they joined the AAF, they participated in it. So about 21.7% of them planted trees or contributed to conservation areas. And the average number of trees planted is 2.25. Okay. So we confirm that actually this big tech initiative contribute a lot to the environmental behaviors of individuals because a very high participation rate. And also we document a gender difference in participation. And we found that women, for example, women are more likely to participate in AAF than men. Okay. also they plant more trees, okay, and they contribute to the conservation areas, and they start to the above activities sooner after participation in AAF, and they are more proactively on official recognition. And when they invest in the Alipay platform, they invest in funds with portfolios with a high ESG rating. Although such environmental friendly investment does not achieve the better investment performance. Yeah. So all, there are all evidence that supports the idea that there is a gender difference. We also have a look at the demographic and the geographic heterogeneities, and we find that okay, the behavior difference, the gender difference is more significant for the group of people who are young or have a higher monthly total expenditures or have higher monthly total expenditures on pleasure. Or we look at the city difference at the city level, the cross-sectional difference at city level, we find okay, more significant result for the individuals in cities with a higher GDP per capita, more population, larger population, or better educated. Okay. And we also rule out two alternative explanations. The first one is the first argument is maybe that the women's higher participation rate is because they got more energy points there. They accumulated more energy points because you have to spend your energy point to plant a virtual tree on the platform. Actually, we rule out this explanation because we find that no, we find women actually got less energy point than men. The second alternative argument is that women may be more socialized, so that they got more co-plantings. They co-plant trees with others, are more likely to co-plant. And we actually find no, this is not the way, right? Okay. About our data and sample, actually, we got 200,000 individuals that are randomly selected user of Alipay. The sample period is 2 years from 2018 to 2019. So the data is the monthly data. So totally we got 4.8 million observations. Okay, at the individual month level, right? And we got that information about that individuals. And our sample, that is random selected and that covers all 332 major cities, covers all Chinese provinces, so that is quite representative. And as it is randomly selected, so we got the distribution of the real populations quite match with our sampled individuals. And we got the the personal characteristics also, right? So let me show you about the energy point. Actually, there are more than something like more than 30 energy types. Okay, that is the behavior that can help you to generate energy points. For example, if we look at the offline mobile payment, if you any day if you pay with a mobile payment, you can accumulate 5 grams of saved carbon emission, right? So that you got 5 grams per payment for the energy points. And if you walk instead of driving a car, actually you got 0.0164 grams less carbon emission. So you accumulate 0.0164 grams of energy point per step. Okay, so that is the energy point. With that energy point, if you like, you can spend your energy point to plant a real tree. So that is the price for a tree, right? The different prices, right? If you use something like 2,700, then you can got this name the conservation area, or you can plant different trees with a different cost of energy points. The other information actually, we actually, mainly the information about the investment choice. Okay, what type of fund you buy in the Alipay platform, then we get what type of funds. Then we know the funds, and we can calculate the rating of ESG or E of the individual stocks of the funds we calculate. So of that. And so that has variables. I will just skip it. Now, our empirical models actually, we got the participation, environmental participation as our dependent variables, and we got the different individual characteristics as independent variables. For our model actually, we got models for individual level regressions, and for individual month level regressions. So the city month fixed effect and city times month fixed effect are all included. And we got standard errors two-way clustered. And summary statistics here we report, in the upper panel, we report that is the individual level variables. And in the lower panel, that is the individual month level results. Okay, I just skip here to go to our, the regression results. Okay, so first one, we actually, our test is a baseline test to see the gender difference or the effect of gender on the environmental participation behaviors. And we actually find very, strong and robustness results. Okay, this is the OLS regression, and we find, yes, the women. So gender is defined as a dominant to 1 for women and 0 for men. Okay, so we find very strong evidence that women are more likely to participate, and they plant more trees. Okay, and they are more proactively after they join the AAF. Okay, so very strong evidence, and we got robustness test. First one, the logic model for the dummy variables as dependent variable, and also we got city times month fixed effect as robustness check, and they are all quite very strong results. Okay, the next one we want to test whether the official recognition, that is to see whether women are more sensitive to the official recognition. And actually, that is in January of 2019. Actually, there is a official recognition that is if you plant a virtual tree on the Alipay platform, then you will receive official certificate. So and we find consistent evidence, right? If you plant a virtual tree, then you got a certificate, and we find that yes, women are more sensitive in tree planting behaviors. The next one we have a look, as we have documented their women are more active in tree planting. That is evidence for environmentally friendly behaviors. And the second one, we want to see whether they are behaviorally consistent in making investment decisions. And our test is to see the first one, whether they are more preference for environmentally friendly funds, that is a fund with a great ESG. And we find yes. As second one, we want to see whether there's such investment choice they help them to achieve better investment return, and the answer is no. So that evidence that women actually got a preference in the environmentally friendly funds, not for money, right? Also, the cross-sectional variations, right? We look at the age, the total expenses and the pleasure expenses, and also as GDP per capita, population, education, they are all at city level, and we all find the consistent evidence. So I just skip here. Now, next one, okay, the two alternative explanations are just ruled out, as I have explained, right? The first one is about whether they got more energy points or energy counts. The answer is no. And the second one is whether they got more co-planting, and we exclude the co-planting, we still get our results. So we rule out both of the alternative explanations. And lastly, we got a test for endogeneity as women's participation may be not endogenously determined, and we find our results still hold. Okay. So lastly, let me conclude. The first one, we find by doing this study, actually, we find big tech plays a significant role in incentivizing individuals' participation, okay, in environmentally friendly behaviors, okay, because we find a very high participation rate, and we find, okay, actually, in China, okay, in our sample, actually more than 80% of participation rate. And the gender difference that is highlighted is also about whether you participate or whether you plant a tree or how many trees you plant, all that result. So finally, our implication is that, we provide empirical evidence to support the idea of utilizing digital technologies to combat climate change and also enhance the women's representation in environmental governance. So that's all for our paper. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Just 20 minutes. Yeah.
Mute. Thank you very much, Professor Louis. Perfect timing as well. Before we move to the Q&A round, which will be after the discussion, I would like to invite Professor Tomoki Fuji to provide his discussion of the paper for around 8 minutes. So please go ahead whenever you're ready, Fuji-san.
Thank you, John. Let me share the screen. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, let me start. So thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Professor Chigui Liu's paper on big tech, gender, and environmental behavior. I read this paper with great interest. This paper adds to the literature on the gender difference in environmental behavior, among other things. And what I like about this paper is the data set that the authors use. It's very unique. It is administrative data set from Alipay Ant Forest with 200,000 individuals in all major Chinese cities. And the data sets contain information about individuals as well as environmental behaviors. And investment behaviors. And this, AAF platform enables users to participate in environmental activities easily. So this would significantly remove the gender difference in participation constraint, which was a major problem in existing studies. So in my view, there are at least, 5 important findings. First, women are more likely to participate in, environmental activities through AAF. They are also more likely to participate in tree planting and conservation, which is done virtually first, and then it will become real when certain conditions are met. Women are more responsive to exogenous external recognition through National Compulsory Tree Planting Due Diligence Certificate, and they are more likely to invest in funds that consist of stocks with higher ESG ratings. So this suggests that women are also likely to, take environmental behavior through investing. They also note that there is more pronounced gender difference in environmental behaviors among cities that are larger, more developed, or have a better educated people. Now, the topic is very interesting, and the paper is generally written pretty well. However, there is a room for improvement. First, some of the outcomes, such as tree planting to date and conservation area to date, do not appear to be adequately modeled in the current paper. Clearly, there is a autocorrelation at the individual level. If you haven't, planted any tree yesterday, then you haven't planted any tree the day before, or if you haven't planted any tree last month, you haven't planted any tree the month before, and so forth. So it seems to me that the Kaplan-Meier estimator or some type of survival analysis since the start of AAF or something similar would be more suitable for the analysis of these outcomes. Second, the validity of IEV is somewhat questionable. The IV here is the time elapsed since the first use of Alipay. So if Alipay can be used for any of the energy point activities, then the loyalty with Alipay could affect the characteristics of individuals that directly affect energy point activities. And this is not through the channel of AF registration. So one of the things that is of particular concern, perhaps maybe mobile payment, because you've been using Alipay for a long time. You tend to use mobile payment for everything. So that may be a direct effect of the IV. It'll be useful to do some kind of robustness check in order to address this issue. With respect to the violation of exclusion restriction. You can, for example, look at Conley and others' paper in Restat. And somewhat related to this point, using the number of years of Alipay before the start or announcement of AF is perhaps slightly more convincing. Because once this has started, that might also affect the number of years with Alipay. I mean, there may be some users who start using Alipay because of AF, but if you restrict the number of years, before the announcement or before the start, you can mitigate these concerns. There are some additional analysis that authors could consider doing. For example, the authors could conduct Oaxaca blinder type decomposition analysis in order to unpack the gender gap. So right now the results indicate the gender difference, but it's a bit unclear whether that's coming from some observable differences between the genders or something else. You can also perhaps check the representativeness of the sample. I know that the paper compare the population from the census population against the Alipay data, but it will be also good to check the age profile in each city. One potential worry that I have is that tech-savvy young population may be overrepresented in the current sample. Finally, the authors may also want to consider alternative definition of AF participation. So taking the registration status at the end of the sample period is definitely not unreasonable, but we may also want to know the difference in characteristics at the beginning of the sample period, or even how fast men and women choose to participate in AF since the rollout. So that's all from me. I really enjoyed, and thank you for the presentation. Back to you, John.
Thanks very much, Fuji-san, for the excellent comments. You've provided some excellent comments on the econometric specification and other issues around the empirical strategy. And I would echo those comments as well. In addition, I would like to ask about some further intuition behind the results found. You know, you've presented a lot of findings for gender-specific results, but what can we say about the intuition behind this in terms of drawing on previous literature that may have some correlation to the findings that you've made, for example? I would like to hand the floor. Actually, there's one question in the Q&A box. Oh, two questions. So one says, are the environmental behavior sustained for longer periods by use of AAP? So is there a duration effect related to AAP? Second point is, are women participating in environmental conservation because of AAP or their inherent qualities? So this is somewhat related to my comment about providing some rationale or some intuition behind the results. So with that, I would like to hand the floor back to Professor Louis, who has around 5 minutes to basically answer everything, including the comments of Fuji-san. So go ahead, Professor Louis. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Professor Fuji, for your comment. I really appreciate it. And thanks for your suggestions about, you know, the model issues, a lot of things that I think we need to further address, yes. And actually, for your question about the IV, yes, we actually, one thing I want to you know mention is you know, the AAF is actually launched I think in 2016, right? But the Alipay actually is you know, have been widely used in China by individuals for, you know, more than, you know, 20 years actually. So we believe that at this stage that is the best IV that we can use, right? But actually we will try to, you know, the test as you have, you know, just suggested. And so if possible, I would like to ask whether you can send your, you know, your PPT to me after the conference, right? We can further, you know, do some tests about it. Thank you. Okay. No, actually, about the gender issue, yes, actually, so as I mentioned, the study is supported by, you know, anti-financial actually. So at the very beginning, when I get the data, actually, I applied for their support, right? I have to make, you know, proposals. Actually, at that time, actually, my focus is, you know, to have a look at the determinants that have influence on the environmental behaviors. Okay, I believe that is interesting, but actually, when I get the data, I need to focus on one thing. But and actually, I find that gender is probably, you know, the best for me, for us to start our first project, because this is just you know, the first project that we did with this data, right? And at the very beginning is, you know, gender is the gender issue is widely, you know, studied, right, by a lot of literature actually for in the past, you know, few decades. But actually, and as after, you know, reading that literature, we find that yes, like I have mentioned about the participation constraints, and that is a big issue. And we believe that our data or our settings that allow us to, you know, to make some contribution to the literature. And also, I think the gender is less, you know, compared to other studies, actually the gender is, you know, less is less likely to you know, like endogenously determined. So that's why actually we pick up it as our study setting, right? Yes.
Okay, Professor Louis, are you completed? Yes.
Oh, yes, yes, yeah.
Thank you very much. There's another comment in the chat, making reference to the implications of the results for corporate governance. So you may want to consider that as well. So thank you, Professor Lee and Fuji-san, for these excellent comments. I hope that Professor Lee will implement a revision based on these comments, and we look forward to seeing the revised paper. So now we will turn to the final paper for this session, which will be delivered by Professor Piyush Tiwari, who's Professor of Property at the University of Melbourne, Australia. He will present a paper entitled Examining the Impact of Just Transition in India. The discussant will be Levu Hai, who's a research associate here at ADBI. But first, let me hand the floor to Professor Tiwari. You have 20 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for a very kind introduction. I would also like to thank ADBI for giving me opportunity to present this paper. Let me share my slides and see if we can view this. Are you all able to see this?
Yes, thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. So this is the work which I did with colleagues from IRADE, a think tank based in New Delhi. My colleagues may have joined the webinar at this moment. I would like to acknowledge their contribution. Professor Jyoti Parekh, Dr. Mohit Kumar, Navpreet Saini, and Mohit Kumar Gupta. Now, the other thing which I would like to say is that this is a very high level paper in the sense that we are trying to understand the impact that the just transition would have in India. And so the numbers that we are trying to estimate here are at a very high level. Okay. So the understanding that we have is there is a need for just transition in India, but there are also challenges. Given that the economy is growing at a very fast rate, the 2010 to 2022 average growth has been around 6%, which requires that supporting this economy would require energy resources at also growing at a very rapid pace. The demand for energy resources would also grow at a very rapid pace. Now, the challenge here is that 55% of country's energy needs are met by coal-fired power plants. Consequently, the country is one of the largest emitters in the world. However, when we view it from the per capita carbon dioxide point of view, the contribution is relatively lower. This also highlights another point, which means that going forward, as the economy is growing and the incomes are increasing, the demand for energy would further increase. India is committed to net zero, and there is a nationally determined commitment to achieve 50% cumulative clean electric power installed by 2020 and be net zero by 2070. The issue here is that the energy transition is not as simple as one would think, and there are huge social costs. And this is one of the focus of this particular work that we are presenting today. So there are two objectives. One is to examine the upstream and downstream impact of closure of coal mines, given that a large chunk of India's energy is met through coal-fired power plants. Transition would mean a number of those coal mines would have to be decommissioned, and there would be upstream and downstream impact of those closures. Our focus particularly would be on the lives and livelihood of people involved, and I'll come to that in a moment. The second is to look at the levers that are currently available to finance social cost. And here we would highlight that these sources are not enough to meet the resource requirement, the finance requirement for just transition in India. Let me start with some of the estimates, and these are the estimates which CEW had prepared in terms of the total investment that is required if India were to achieve net zero by 2070. There are other scenarios also which they had done. What they are saying here is that if this is the target, then India would need $10 trillion worth of investment. Some of this investment would come from domestic sources, both public and private, and some would have to be sourced from outside through, again, public and private sources and international investment. And they also identify that there is investment support of about 1.4 trillion would be necessary. This is to hedge the cost of sourcing fund from overseas. Example here would be, like, for example, hedging the currency risk and so on. Now, what is important here is that of the $10 trillion that would be required, a large chunk, about 8.4 trillion, would be for the power sector. But this is not the full story. Now here, the investment gap or the investment requirement that are being projected is only for the infrastructure part, which is necessary to, say, move from the coal power plants to renewable sources of energy. Mobility from vehicles that are IC based or internal combustion based to more greener vehicles and so on. This doesn't include the cost that would be incurred or the resources that would be required in order to meet the needs of addressing the social and economic costs that the country would face. And that is the focus that we have for this particular work that we are presenting. To give you an idea, in India, the total coal production is in 2021-22 was about 777 metric tons. About 209 metric tons of coal was imported, and there are 10 states where there are 442 mines which are active. The challenge, however, is that many of these mines are operating at a very low productivity. Only 27% of mines in India produce coal which is more than 1 million tons per year. When we look at our different energy scenarios, the chart here on the right-hand side indicates there that there are different possibilities. Now, if India was to achieve net zero by, let's say, 2060, the orange line would indicate that the requirement for coal would continue to increase up to 2030, then it will stabilize a bit, and then it will start falling. If India were to achieve by net zero by 2050, the reduction in coal post 2030 would be much faster. Now, the issue becomes much more complicated because the coal transition has a number of other linked issues. They are related to, say, restructuring of coal mines, switching of power generation from coal-fired plants to renewable sources. There are labor retrenchment, closure of coal mines. The land which is left behind once the mine is closed would be required to repurpose or rehabilitated. That also has a cost. So there are many issues that are associated with the mine closure. Now, if we look at the impact of coal transition on labor force in particular, which is one of the significant social costs that just transition would hold. In case of coal mines, in 2017-18, about 329,000 workers were employed. These were those who were departmental workers as well as those who were contractual workers. In addition to these, there are 1 million workers who are connected with coal mines indirectly. So what it means is that transitioning away from coal would have quite a significant impact on the livelihood of more than 1.5 million people. There is an estimated 165,000 workers who are employed in 311 unprofitable mines. These mines are unprofitable because they are operating at a very low productivity. They're not making any money. There are about the similar number who are employed in 114 viable mines. Now, The other impact of transitioning away from coal would be on the transport sector. 46% of total coal transport in India is through the road. The trucks that carry coal, they have a capacity of about 15 to 20 ton, and they employ more than 100,000 people in their operation as well as payload per year. The other significant impact would be on Indian Railways. Roughly about 54% of coal is transported through railways, and a large chunk of freight revenue of Indian Railways is the coal freight revenue, almost 47% in 2019-20, and it has remained fairly robust over the years. The impact of transitioning would have significant impact on freight revenue that railways earn, which also subsidizes passenger transport or passenger fare in case of railways. %55 of country's power need is through coal-fired thermal power plants, which employ 700,000 people. And many of these are located within some of the states in our country. Now, let's look at another issue, which is related to land. Coal mines occupy roughly about 0.5 million hectares of land, which is either under the lease or a freehold agreement of operational or temporarily closed mine. So reclamation and repurposing would have significant impact on these lands. Now, if we look at the data from one of the mines that was closed, this is in Ramgarh in Jharkhand, it indicates that a large chunk of the land that the mine was holding was under excavation or external overburden dump, or maybe a safety zone or green belt, or under protected zone, which is undisturbed. So the flexibility to repurpose this land is very limited. Now, if we look at the cost of closing a mine, there are certain cost rates which are applied for in India for closing a mine, which are very low. For an open cast mine, that's about $12,000 per hectare. For underground mine, it's about $2,000 per hectare. But the actual cost, as was indicated in the case of Ramgarh, Jharkhand, when the mine was closed, the actual cost that came to was 6 times the escrow corpus that some of these rates which are indicated here had accumulated. So the cost of closure is far higher. And the challenge here is that in the current mechanism, the closure cost only includes the technical, biological, subsidence management, safety, demolition, and so on. It doesn't include, to a large extent, the social cost of, say, retrenchment or loss of employment that a mine closure will lead to. We did some estimate, and based on the numbers that we extracted from the annual reports of Coal India Limited. And what we determined there is that the closure of unprofitable mine would mean that there is loss of employment of significant number of workers, 165,000 workers. Now, if we were to use law, which say Germany has, wherein if a mine is decommissioned, the workers would, if they are say 55 or 57 years of age, they would be supported, their livelihood would be supported until the age of retirement. If we use, though India doesn't have that kind of law, if we were to use a similar kind of norm, what it means is that the employment loss for departmental worker at mines would be about would cost about 3.5 billion per year. This is at 2020 exchange rate. The contractual and informal worker would cost further 1 billion per year. This is based on the actual payment per worker that happens each month, which is much lower than what an employee with a Coal India Limited gets. So the cost of supporting the workers who would lose job is quite significant. Now, if we add to that what happens with the employment of viable mine, again, roughly about $4.5 billion per year would be added to that. Thermal power plant, we extracted the wage cost or wage rate based on Power Grid Corporation's annual report. And here, what it indicates is that the shift or the loss of jobs that the thermal power plants would see would cost about 25 billion per year. The challenge, however, is that the financing of coal transition is in very early stages. We could identify 3 sources of finances, which at the outset are very low or rather insufficient to meet any of these requirements. So these 3 existing instruments are the corporate social responsibilities of various companies, both public and private sector. Here, I would like to highlight the contribution of private sector is much larger than the public sector. The second is the District Mineral Foundation funds. This is a fund that the mining companies pay as a royalty and is set aside for the benefits of mine workers. The third is the social impact bonds. These are bonds which are issued for subscription, and the funds raised are invested in for social impact projects. And many of these projects which will arise out of just transition would fall under those categories. The challenge, however, is that the CSR spending, if you look at the circled states here, is mostly in the west side of the country, while the major coal belts in India are on the east side. So that causes a kind of a dichotomy here, because the projects which the corporates are funding through their CSR contribution are largely on the west side. Now, the district mineral funds, they were established by the government of India in 2015, where the companies would pay 30% of the royalty amount for the lease that they are granted. However, if we look at the funds that have been collected between 2015 and 2021, they have accumulated about 6.25 billion, which compared to the cost that we were talking about is very, very small. And of which only 39% have been collected from mine, which are coal and lignite mines. This could be possibly a source of funding for just transition. But again, I would like to highlight that this is an insufficient to meet all the requirements that are there. The third important instrument is the social impact bond, which was first launched in 2010 in the UK. They are the outcome-based contracts in the sense that here the funding, the bond raises money in order to fund some social outcome. And if those outcomes are achieved, the investor in those bonds will earn a return. Now here, in case of India, there are 3 contracted impact bond projects which have been funded. And there are about 800,000 beneficiaries. And one of the impact bond is being used for National Skill Development Corporation. Again, there's a potential here in order to raise funding for reskilling of the workers who will lose jobs in just transition mechanisms. So just to conclude this, as I said to you, there's a very high level and there's a work in progress. And we would like to hear some of the comments that we can take on board in order to develop this paper further. What we have done here is that we have highlighted that there is a need to assess the socio-economic cost of mine closure. What is being talked at the moment is pretty much like what would the just transition infrastructure cost would be. But there's a huge social and economic cost that need to be estimated. The current funding mechanisms are inadequate to finance social cost of transition. We would need to look at the instruments that could then be used or developed further to finance social cost of just transition. The innovative financing mechanisms are required there, and some of the mechanisms like leveraging land or developing domestic market for social impact bond could also be explored. The issue here is that there will be a large chunk of land that would require repurposing. So there's an opportunity to leverage land. The laws related to land, labor, and environment in India at the moment are not fully developed to address the requirements of just transition. I would stop here and would welcome comments and thoughts for further development of this paper.
Thank you very much, Professor Tiwari. We will have a Q&A session after the discussant. I would like to invite the discussant to take the floor now. That will be Le Vu Hai, who is a research associate here at ADBI. So, Hai, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, John.
Okay, so please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, John, for your kind introducing me. So let me share the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, John, and thank you so much for inviting me to be the discussion of the very interesting paper presented by Professor Tiwari. I really enjoyed reading this paper. So without further ado, I would like to start my discussion slide. So before I start, I would like to express that the comment based on the paper I received, and because today I should found out that you improved the paper a lot. Yeah, so please keep in mind that it's based on the paper I received. So basically, my comment divided in 3 parts. The first, I quickly summarize the paper. Second, I would like to say about the strength of the paper. And finally, I provide some comment and suggestion for the author to improve. So first, about the first part of the paper. So this paper studies the impact of the effects of just transition in India, and it addresses the need for India for just transition. Further, the paper provides the blending for co-transition and also the key impacts for just transition. And finally, they provide the financing just transition. So regarding the strength of paper, I realize this because like the paper efficiently addressed the urgent need for India for just transition, and it also analyzed the key impacts of just transition in detail, in very details, including the effect on local employment, effect on road transportation, on the railway, and also power sector. And they also provide the investment prospects for just transition. So next part is my comment. So the first, I would like to talk about address the originality of the paper. So before the author mentioned about the need and for the India to just transition, and they jump into the investigate the impact of like coal mines closing and also on the power and transport sector. So also the impact on employment and investment prospect for just transition. So my suggestion is that they should address why they focus on the 3 above mentioned impacts. So to do this, they can look at the previous paper. So what is the previous paper do? And provide the related literature to distinguish this paper from the past study. So my concern is that is this the first paper to study this impact, and how can they compare with the study from the other developing countries? So for example, like the study from Indonesia. I think there are also some paper on Indonesia for just transition. So this is my first comment. And also my second comment is about like in the abstract and introduction, the author mentioned about the energy transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. We need the development of policies, capacity building of community, financing the efforts towards smooth transition, and technological cooperation between developed and developing country. And it is most important to develop industrial capacity through the research and development or R&D programs that would be critical for just transition. So I just found out that throughout the paper, they as per the current version I received, they didn't mention about this kind of policy recommendation elsewhere in the paper, except the abstract and the introduction. So my suggestion is that the authors can cite some previous literature, or it's better, or even better, if they can provide the analysis to support this, like the evidence to support this, and after that they can mention them in the policy recommendation based on the analysis. And next is about the blend for the blending for coal transition. The author mentioned about India produced like 777 million ton of coal and imported more than 200 million ton in 2021 and 2022, and it has 442 active coal mines distributed across 10 states on March 2021, and the number of coal mines in India had declined in the last few years, while the production has increased. And in India, 73% of the total coal mines produce less than 1 million ton per mile annually, while 27 large mines produce 61% of India annual production. So my impression is that for this section, they focused like on the current status and also some trend for the coal, or without talking on the blending, talking much on the blending of the government. So my suggestion is that the author can improve the paper by focus like mention more on the blend of the government, or they can like mention about the key feature of just energy transition for coal in India over the next decade. And they elaborate more and mention here. I think they mentioned in the introduction, but they cannot mention it here to like make the section clearer. And about the author also have the section like disposal section, and I found this section is too short for standalone section, and they mention about coal consumption and its production, and there's no number or analysis shown as the current version of the paper. So I suggested like the author can improve by qualitative analysis, and also, and another thing, maybe the author can safely remove this section, because I think it's, for my point, it's not necessary to be here. And finally, I think the conclusion and policy recommendation are needed. At the moment, the author didn't provide the conclusion in the paper. So, and some policy recommendation, I think the author mentioned it in the section financing just transition, so they can safely transfer some part of the recommendation here. And also like the author can also provide some recommendation like rescue policy initiative, because they mentioned about the impact of on local employment. So I think if they can write something about like rescue policy initiative of the India government, so it would be great. So that's all for my that's also for my discussion. So I really enjoy it, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Hai, for excellent discussion. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or chat. I would just like to basically reiterate what Hai has been saying. You know, so the transition to renewable is clearly a costly exercise from a socioeconomic standpoint. And my question therefore would be, what can be learned about mainstreaming the just transition into public policy, and on the scope for PPP arrangements, such as what we've seen with the ADB's energy transition mechanism, which basically factors in an element for just transition specifically through PPPs. So there may be some lessons to be learned there for the case of India. I know that the pilot is for Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam in the case of the ETM, but there may be scope for some lessons to be drawn there. At very least, it should be included in the paper somewhere, given that it's you know, a key mechanism in the region that looks at the just transition issue. So with that, I would like to hand the floor back to Professor Tiwari to spend around 4 or 5 minutes addressing and responding to the comments. So please go ahead, Professor Tiwari.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks Hai, for fantastic comments, and we would very much like to take them on board. They all are very appropriate, and I can see that they will make significant contribution in terms of improving our paper. So we would do that. Can I request you, if it's okay, to share the slides which you had presented? Hi.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Right. Okay.
I think
Thank you very
like the organizer will share the slide, all the slide to the presenter.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I have nothing more to add at this stage, and
Okay.
we will be submitting our paper revised version in due course.
Okay, so thanks very much, Professor Tiwari. Yes, as I said, all of the papers presented today all of the authors of papers presented today will receive the discussion slides after the event. So with that, we come to the end of day 2 of this conference. Thank you very much to all the speakers today. I think we have learned a great deal and developed on the interesting insights that we had yesterday. We will have the final day of this conference tomorrow, which will commence at 10:30 a.m. Tokyo time. So with that, I close the conference for today. Thank you very much and goodbye.